Prayers.
Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we beseech thee, unto thy servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that they may in all things walk before thee with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in their several offices, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President. Announcements by Your Honor the President.
I have received for confirmation the minutes of meetings held on November 23rd and December 7th, 2022. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the confirmation of the minutes of those dates.
Question is, are the minutes of the meeting of the Senate held on Wednesday, November 22nd, 2022, and Wednesday, December 7th, 2022, be confirmed. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting the ayes have it. Those minutes stand confirmed. In terms of further announcements, we received an apology for absence from Senator Kevin Boyce, and an indication of a late arrival from Senator Monique Tate. And also apologies for expected lateness from Senator Jerome Walcott.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I am commanded to lay the following: the Civil Aviation General Application and Personnel Licensing Amendment Regulations of 2022.
Reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate moved by a minister, introduction of bills, public business.
Public business is the order of the day.
Order number 2, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Road Traffic Amendment Bill 2022.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg your permission to treat to orders number 2 and 3 on the order paper as a cognate debate.
The question is that items number 2 and 3, item number 2 being the second reading of the Road Traffic Amendment Bill, and item number 3 being the second reading of the Road Traffic Learners Permits and Driver's Licenses Validation Bill, be treated as a cognate debate. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Of course, just a reminder that the matters will, in accordance with the rules, be voted on as separate items on the order paper 2 and 3. But in the second reading speeches, the leader of business will speak to the policy intent of both pieces of legislation, and the second reading debate will be on matters related to both items. Other comments?
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This is a relatively simple debate on two matters. And in the first instance, it is an amendment as it relates to the ages that are being validated in this instance. And so, well, I should say in the first place, it is an amendment which allows us to treat to the utilization of the new Trident identification cards as the basis for the identification of persons dealing with driver's licenses. And the second one is a validation bill for a matter that is somewhat dated, and we want to be able to go back into time somewhat and to ensure that persons under a certain age for whom licenses have been issued for certain categories of operations on the road, that those things are now validated. So in summary, I'm going to start from the end and go backwards. So I'm going to start with the validation bill, Mr. President. So we have, in the first instance, Mr. President, a scenario where we have under section 69.1 of the Road Traffic Act, cap 295, we have a number of amendments that are being proposed, and I'm going to go through what those amendments are in principle. One, that the driving licenses and permits issued during the period December 11th, 2017 up to September 30th, 2022 to persons under the age of 25 years of age in the categories as follows: public service vehicles, PSV, motor tractor, and heavy goods vehicles are to be deemed valid. The period that I am referring to, again, Mr. President, is that from December 11th, 2017, and then September 30th, 2022. Those fees that were collected in the issuance of the driving licenses for that corresponding period would have been lawfully collected, Mr. President, for those persons in that age group under 25 in the categories to which I have referred. And then the third element, Mr. President, is the actual approval of the validation by way of the legislation that is before us. In summary, Mr. President, we had somewhat of an administrative lacuna that existed between 2017, where the persons in that particular category were in fact paying the fees, were in fact enabled to get their licenses, but the legislation did not actually recognize it in the same way. And now we have this gap that is taking place, Mr. President, that we are now attempting to address and to validate. But there's a broader, beyond the seemingly benign legislative reforms that we are now attempting to put in place and the validation of that period, Mr. President, we're now dealing with the empowerment and the ability of a category of person in an age group that is of concern to us. And each time we gather in this place and in the other place and in the public space, we're talking, Mr. President, about the crisis in particular of young people. We're talking about the crisis affecting persons in the 25 age group and under, and in some instances, slightly older. We're talking about challenges of unemployment or underemployment. We're talking about the challenges of indiscipline, lack of opportunity, empowerment, enfranchisement, the need for inclusion, Mr. President. And these are all commercially driven licenses that we are speaking about. We're not talking, Mr. President, about the ability to drive my personal little car. We're not talking about the ability for us to go from my friend to your friend and to line. We're talking about a category of license that empowers a category of young person to engage in meaningful employment by way of public service vehicles, the provision of public sector transportation in the first instance, motor tractor. The agricultural sector, for example, is heavily driven by, no pun intended, by the provision of heavy-duty equipment and the ability of persons to be able to use this equipment is critical. And a lot of times, Mr. President, you know, you hear my colleagues and others who function in the agricultural sector praising, on the one hand, the young people who have demonstrated or expressed an interest in coming into the agricultural sector, on the one hand, or lamenting, on the other side of the coin, the absence of youth in agriculture. So you have this balancing act that has to be played out. And then you have a heavy-duty goods vehicle, Mr. President. You have large vehicles, container trucks, heavy-duty vehicles, however so defined, persons in the under 25 category being enabled to, once they have passed their driving test and they have completed all of the required road traffic arrangements that are regulated already by law, to be eligible for a valid license or a permit to operate these types of vehicles. And Mr. President, what we are simply attempting to do in this instance is to validate that which was already being done since 2017, but now needs to have the benefit of the force of law. So, Mr. President, I am not certain that this is a point on which we will have any extensive debate or disputes or any of the kinds of things that perhaps may attend in other instances. But if we do, we are obviously in a position to share what the perspective of this administration is. And that, Mr. President, is the first amendment that we're speaking about. The second one speaks specifically to the utilization of the new identification card to be used as a proxy for the driver's license. Now, Mr. President, it is on this that I would wish to spend a moment. Mr. President, I have received, as of September this year, my new Trident ID card. It's real pretty. I like it a lot. We had a scenario, Mr. President, where over the last year, we then began, as a government, to have a national campaign encouraging Barbadians to apply for and to go and get their new identification cards. I have to confess, Mr. President, that if we did not have this campaign and if we were not launching new identification cards, the photo that I took at 18 years old, that is still the photo on my ID card that is now dog ears on the corner, and probably not in ideal shape, and every time I have to pull it out for use, it looks real bad. I probably would not have a new ID card if there was not a campaign. I would still be using my old ID card. On the issue of driver's licenses, I am still navigating, especially here in Barbados, utilization of both my Trident ID card. I haven't actually had to use it yet, so I'm a little disappointed by that. But my ID card on the one hand and my driver's license on the other hand. Now, there is no questioning that over an extended period of time, there were some difficulties with the issuances of driver's licenses. I, like many Barbadians, can acknowledge that for almost a year, I drove around with my receipt from the BRA in my car because I did not have a driver's license. I didn't have one. I had a receipt. And so for one reason or the other, I didn't have an ID card. I had no time to attempt to spend the length of time that it took to go from the BRA, stand up in the line, pay to get your license, to renew your license. And I usually do it for 3 years because I want to minimize the pain a little bit. Do it for 3 years, and then go to another location somewhere else to get my driver's license, and I'm still using the photo that I had from before, and there's nothing that changes on my driver's license except the fact that it is now renewed from X date to Y date. So the idea that a new identification card, which is current, which is driven by technology, which has the opportunity to be updated, can be used as a proxy for a driver's license is something that is welcomed by many Barbadians who, like me, do not want to have to replicate one process for another. This is outside of the reasons why a government may be doing it, because obviously more information about us is captured in the identification card as opposed to that which was in our original driver's license. So, Mr. President, it lays out in the course of the amendment what is being proposed. It proposes the following, Mr. President. It outlines the steps to be taken by the driver of a motor car on a public road who has to, for one reason or the other, present their identification card or their driver's license to a police officer in uniform. What is now required, was probably what was always required, the driver must produce his driver's license or identification card. The two can be used as proxy to the police station designated by the police officer or the transport inspector within 24 hours of the request. Mr. President, on how many occasions have we been in an accident, or people have been in an accident, not me so far, me, knock wood, but people have been in accidents and you have had to have the police come to the scene, and the first thing that the police officer asks you to present is your driver's license. The second thing that they ask you for, driver's license and registration, please. As back in the day, when you used to have to do registration. Then they say driver's license and insurance, please. But driver's license is a must. In the absence, Mr. President, of a driver's license, your information giving that your driver's license is current and up to date is meant to be captured within the information covered by the new identity card. And on that basis, the amendment allows for us to use on the presentation of our identity documents to a police officer or a transport officer, either or, provided that the two have the correct information, and the Trident ID card will do so. It sets out the offense of contravening the relevant subsections, Mr. President, where you have failed to produce your driver's license or a valid driver's license. And you are liable to a summary conviction, and the fine for that, Mr. President, is $1,000 or a term of imprisonment of 12 months or both. The amendment goes on, Mr. President, to make reference to the fact that the identification card in this section refers to that which I have just outlined. We call it the Barbados Identity Management Act, and therefore it produces the identification card that we are speaking about. And it goes on to talk about changes that thereafter now will need to be made to the Barbados Identity Management Act, the schedule of that, specifically in columns 1 and columns 2 of the schedule. It goes on, Mr. President, to speak simply to the matter of proclamation, but in effect, in the first instance, the validation bill allows us to validate that which was in operation from 2017 up until 2010-22 as it relates to persons driving PSV vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, motor tractors, and to allow that to come into force and to validate that was done, that which was done before, and to make the fees that were collected valid. And the second item, Mr. President, speaks to an amendment allowing for a person to take advantage now of the utilization of your Trident identity card. Your Trident identity card is now being used as a proxy for your driver's license. It is a simple matter in principle, Mr. President, and those are the matters before this honorable chamber today. And with those few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that these bills now be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Speakers? Senator Maladu.
Mr. President, thank you. I actually rose to speak on what I had read, but Senator Cummins has raised something that I did not see in any of the documents, which is this Trident identification. So while I try to figure out where that is, I will go ahead with what my prepared comments were. Mr. President, thank you for recognizing me. The amendments before us today are well articulated and have been explained very clearly. I have no objection to such, and I'm happy to support the changes. It has been the practice for the last 5 years, and so we're regularizing what has been done. However, it's becoming a theme of my comments to express my disappointment when a piece of legislation is amended, but other well-known fundamental flaws or weaknesses within the same legislation are not addressed, but rather just one or a few elements are changed, such as in this case. Mr. President, I think that the government has missed the opportunity to address the problems in this legislation that have been aired for the last several years. Mr. President, please allow me to offer the following specific examples, and I would like to tie this all together under the banner of the need for growth within our economy. When I last spoke in this chamber, I referred to the Honourable Prime Minister's challenge to the private sector to drive growth in our economy. At that time, I said, and I say again, that impediments to growth must be addressed and removed. Our economy is being held back by archaic rules and practices that must be challenged, modernized, and dare I say, eradicated. Such practices are built into the legislation in some cases, in practices within government departments, and in some cases, in the people within the various departments. But Mr. President, I referred in my last time I spoke in this chamber to the practice of the port health officer boarding every inbound international flight before anyone could deboard, if that's the right word, disembark. I have not since heard of any justification for it, but it continues up to this weekend. Now, in the context of the Road Traffic Act, let me point out a few more archaic processes that simply waste time and money, in my opinion. At the outset, let me be clear, I am not referring to any of the great people who work at the Pine. I am dealing with the legislation and the framework that sets out for the people how to do their job. My comments and suggestions refer to the legislation. Cap 295 is the underlying legislation that we are amending today. Section 9.1, trade plates. This is the first opportunity where we could have fixed this. Mr. President, the section of this legislation requires that when a trade plate is used, the entity who has been issued with the trade plates must fill out the trade license book. The details as the purpose of use, the time period, the actual route that the vehicle will take, all must be entered into this book in duplicate, Mr. President. What purpose does this really serve in this modern world? I asked the industry operators what purpose they serve, and no one could tell me. It's antiquated and really serves no purpose. It's a waste of time and valuable resources, frankly. Further in this same piece of legislation, Section 27, and a few other places, refers to a weight certificate. Mr. President, do you know that every new vehicle coming into this island must be presented to the MTW in order for it to be weighed and a weight certificate produced? Mr. President, do you know that every vehicle that is imported to the island is accompanied by a set of documents that certify its weight prior to it being exported, and that same information is already in the customs Asakudo forms? This is a system that's relied upon globally. So I ask, what is the purpose of this process of weighing a vehicle? Do these vehicles, when they ship from Japan or the US or Europe on their way across their journey, do they change their weight in some way? So recently I was told of a rental car company that was weighing 15 new Toyota Yaris's. One by one, like lemons, they're driven to the Pine, fuel wasted, time wasted. A vehicle of a known weight can get a certificate from a weight scale in Barbados. Mr. President, seeing how absurd this practice has been, I thought I would research what was the genesis of this, since it's in the underlying legislation that we're talking about today. And I'm informed that there was a time when the license fee for a vehicle was based on the weight. I guess the heavier it was, the more wear and tear on our roads, and hence you paid a higher fee. But Mr. President, we no longer charge a fee based on weight. In fact, the weight is irrelevant to the process. But still, we maintain a weight scale, we employ persons to weigh the vehicles, and we send workers to wait for hours at the Pine to get a certificate that is completely useless. It contains no information that we don't have before. It's already in the government system. So, Mr. President, growth does not come from wastage. There's no growth in employing people to do things that we do not need to do. Getting a new car sold and on the road and productive is not enhanced by this process. So again, Mr. President, I say the opportunity to fix this legislation was now, and that opportunity has again been wasted. Mr. President, it does not end there. As we know, we were reminded during the pandemic, tourism is a huge part of our economy. In difference to many of our Caribbean competitors in the tourism market, in Barbados, we have a vibrant tourism sector that involves villas and also hotels, where the guests rent cars and explore our island freely and safely. They have done so for years. It is part of the charm of our island. When the tourist gets lost, they follow the bus stops. We all know the stories. They want to get back to the city, look at the bus stop, the intercity one. Trying to get out to the Crane, follow the outer city one. We all know these stories. But even more fun is when they do get lost, they sometimes will stop at a rum shop. And Senator King is looking at me because he would know the story well. And you can imagine some of the instructions they get sometimes. And it usually ends with, well, look, when you get to the Blue House, Mavis lives there, but you're gone too far. So they have a lot of fun. It's part of our culture, getting out and exploring with these tourists. Unfortunately, Mr. President, the rental car companies have been complaining for years that the system of issuing visitor permits, again part of this legislation, is archaic. A few years ago, the license books with the visitor permits were allowed to run out, so there were none to be had. I guess the rental cars companies could not refuse the rental, so the tourists must have driven without the permit. Thank you. So the visitor permits matter is an interesting one because we issue out these books as in the legislation, and the rental car companies then, having received a rental contract in advance and have recorded all of the information, then must fill out in the book and be issued with a visitor permit, and a small fee is collected. My question is, why would we not have fixed this in the legislation? I have had occasion this year to rent cars. I've been lucky or unlucky, I don't know which way you would call it, to rent a car in Canada, United Kingdom, United States, Italy, Bahrain, all about. Thank you. I could go on. And never once have I been asked to have a visitor permit. The rental car company does a very good job of collecting a fee on behalf of the government and paying it over and charging me insurance. But never once do I have to have a book and in duplicate and triplicate. We need to remove these impediments. I wish I was finished at this point in time, but the last thing I will say on the hired car industry, and again, which is part of the legislation, the underlying legislation that we are reviewing, is to talk about the hired car licenses and how that happens. Again, coming up to this winter, I have been reliably informed by the industry that we have more demand than we have permits, than we have rental cars. And the process for getting a hired car license, again, is archaic. It takes a very long time and it is uncertain. I have no idea why it is so, and we need to challenge it. It is another impediment to growth. Why would we, as a government, why would we want to slow down a rental car company who applies for 10 rental car permits or 25 or 30? It's going to cost them $3,500 per car to license it. Plus, then they'll have a car that they can rent and earn some foreign exchange. Why does it take us months, and in some cases now, it's completely uncertain as to whether you will get, maybe you would get 10 licenses, maybe I'll give you 3, and what's the process at the end? Forget. We need to look at that process, and again, as I said, Mr. President, we need to challenge every impediment to growth. I'm going to finish with one story here for you. And the last thing, if I can find in my notes, so bear with me, because I've made a complete disaster of it. I want to tell you one last story where we've missed the opportunity that we could have fixed under this underlying legislation. And Leader of Government Business, Senator Cummings, referred to it in her own presentation when she spoke of not going to stand up in line and wait to renew that permit. Remember, let me tell you about getting a learner's permit in Barbados. Now, we are changing the age for it. Let me tell you about the steps. My youngest son last year got his learner's permit. Step number one, book a date well in advance for your written test. Now, to book a date, you must go in person. That's one trip to the Pine. Step number two, find a BRA office where you can pay your $30 fee. Now, in my case, unfortunately, the Pine cashier desk was closed for a very long time, so I drove to Warren's. So I paid my $30, step number two. Now, you go back to the Pine when you're done that, and you wait about 2 hours to sit a written test. Now, when you finish your written test, if you are so lucky to have passed and done your little test, should I really actually say it out loud here, or are we all embarrassed at this point in time? Because then you've got to drive back to Warren's again, okay? And pay the fee again. And then, when you've done that, you return to the Pine, you wait in line and see if you can get a date to have do the exam. Now, on the day of the exam, this is the last point I'm going to make sure and get there by 6 a.m. Because if you're not there by 6, even though it's your date, you may not get the test at all. In total, I think I spent about 10 hours trying to get my son his driver's license over this period. Probably other people spent longer, maybe some people spent less. But Mr. President, my point is tying it all back to growth. That is not a good use of our time. We can't collect $200 in government revenue from a process that takes 8 or 10 hours of our citizens' time to do it. We need to fix this, and we had the opportunity when we are debating this legislation to not just fix an age. That was easy to fix. I understand we want growth, we want but we need to fix all of these impediments that we have, and we need to focus on it. So this is likely, Mr. President, to be my continued theme when I look at the legislation, and I encourage other senators to do the same. When we look at it, not just look at what is being proposed and the small thing that may need to fix of something we've been doing for the last 5 years, but if we are going to achieve the level of growth that our Prime Minister wants, that our country needs, that our young people need from us, we have to remove these impediments, these obstacles, these archaic ways of doing business and come into the modern world. With those comments, President, I say again, I support the amendments proposed here, but I am disappointed that we have not fixed in further the legislation. Thank you, sir. I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Malado. Her Honor, Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I really want to speak very briefly about a matter that arises in relation to these commercial vehicles, but I have to say how much I enjoyed the remarks of Senator Maladu in terms of the modernization of our processes. We've been talking about the digitalization of government, and it is absolutely critical for efficiency, for convenience, for speed of doing business, for coordinating of activity, and for just making life easy for people and for greater efficiency within the context of government. Many of the functions that we insist that people stand up for hours for in lines at all of government's institutions are things that are routinely done in other countries with a few flicks of a finger on your phone or on your computer. And if Barbados really wants to consider itself a modern country, it is absolutely critical for us to do these. But I think that in every ministry, there needs to be someone, we have all of these IT professionals, there needs to be someone who is looking at systems, processes, and identifying where the bugbears are. I'm hearing a lot about the appointments of directors general, and so on. But we need people who are looking at systems, processes, identifying where the bugbears are, and making recommendations to the various ministries, whether it is their parent ministry or whether it has to go to the Ministry of Smart Technology for the things that need to be done to remove these impediments to efficiency, convenience, speed of doing business, and so on. So I do support Senator Malalu's comments. In fact, it reminded me, you know, I like to give stories. It reminded me of a case that I had done when I was still a practicing attorney, where a tourist came into Barbados, was taking his wife to church at the Roman Catholic Church on Cullimer Rock Road, and he came across, that would be, that's Belleville Road, Pine Road, Belleville Road. No, the one, not the above one, the lower one, the below. George Street, thank you. Yeah, I should know, the seat of the dams, such as there are. Right, came across George Street, and when he got, pardon, the office is on that road. The last time I saw the structure, it was in very, very poor repair, pretty much like the institution itself. When he got to the corner of George Street on Cullimer Rock Road, no, and they attempted the same thing with the country. They have to admire them for consistency. When he got to George Street Road, the end of George Street Road on Cullimer Rock, he turned right and went down Cullimer Rock Road and swung in, or attempted to swing in to the church on that road. He was from the United States and is accustomed, of course, driving on a different side of the road and so on. Attempted to swing in to the compound with the convent, and so there's apparently a Roman Catholic church there or thereabout, and virtually connected with a police vehicle, at which point the police guy said, all right, my man, what are you doing here? So he explained that he was taking his wife to church and so on. He got charged for driving on the wrong side of the road and driving without due care and attention, and the usual road traffic offenses. But then he got charged for not having an appropriate driver's license, because as Senator Malalu was saying at that time, and I believe it is still so, that except for the large car rental companies, if you travel to the United States from Barbados, you can actually drive on your Barbadian license. If you come from the United States to Barbados, you have to have a Barbadian license. You cannot drive on your United States license. Or whether you acquire it from a large rental company, or whether you physically have to go into a police station or into one of the MDW's depots or agencies to get a license, that is the requirement. And he, in his blissful ignorance, having traveled on his US license before, did not realize, so he actually had no license to drive in Barbados. Well, it made me a few $100 in those days in US dollars as the attorney, and he pleaded guilty, and the court said the magistrate was generous with him and said that since he was taking the wife to church, he would dismiss the charges and so on and so forth. So all's well that ended well, so in that regard. But I'd forgotten that story until Senator Malalu started to talk. But that's not where I wanted to make my comments today. I really just wanted to focus on, apart from the efficiencies to which Senator Malalu spoke, and the inconvenience and so on, and the improvement of data collection, because really if you do this online, there's far more certainty, less opportunities for leakage of revenues and so on. The other thing that I think we need to do is to start to collect more data on motor vehicle accidents in Barbados. I don't hear data about motor vehicle accidents. I hear data about types of vehicles. and the number of vehicles on the road. But I don't know, for instance, within which age groups the largest number of motor vehicle accidents occur. I don't have, as a matter of public record, or we do not have, as a matter of public record, the types of motor vehicles involved in accidents. We do not know the types of accidents that occur. Is it that they occur amongst people overtaking when a driver in front is about to make a turn? Is it that they occur through speeding? What is the major cause of accidents? What are the age groups? Do older people, I was going to say 60 or over, that would include me. Do people 70 or over, sir, 70 or over, are the ones having the most motor vehicle accidents, and so on? And I'm not being facetious. I really would like us to be able to start to analyze this kind of information, because I'm one of the people who believes that the more data that you have, the more data you assess, then when you're able to better identify challenges and problems and make appropriate policy interventions to determine where those problems exist. And I am very curious about that kind of thing. Do the majority of motor vehicle accidents take place amongst young people leaving fetes at night? We believe young people are careless drivers, and I hear people saying that. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But what does the data tell us? Is it men who are middle-aged, who are going out to rum shops and liming spots at night and going home when they think they're feeling sweet? In our parlance, really, they're blind drunk. And are they the ones having motor vehicle accidents? Is it people who are working double shifts, working late and falling asleep and having motor vehicle accidents? Is it people who have particular health conditions, whether it's diabetes or sleep apnea or other conditions that would tend to make them fall asleep more quickly, be at risk? I don't know. I'm just throwing things out there. All I'm suggesting is that, can we start collecting, collating, and analyzing this information to see what it tells us? And my final point on this, sir, is again to start with sharing another story. We are talking here about public service vehicles and about people driving them, people who will have the safety and well-being of other road users in their hands. And perhaps the largest category of persons in that group are those who drive public service vehicles. Anybody who drives on Barbados's roads sees the extreme carelessness that a number of ZR drivers with which a number of ZR drivers seem to drive. Over the course of the Christmas season, as they have been hustling more, you often have to pull aside as they attempt to fly past 6 vehicles to cut off another ZR driver who may have stopped at a bus stop, and they want to get past them and pick up the other waiting passengers. You have to be careful that in speeding to pass one another, they don't write you off with a head-on collision. And the other night, I had a really very interesting experience. I came through Wanstead Gardens, where my parents used to live. It is not a road that is on the route of any ZR or public service vehicle. I was coming up the street going, that would be east, to turn right, and I saw a large vehicle, which turned out to be a ZR, coming at me at an extraordinary speed. Now, I had just passed a vehicle on my right and braked to turn right. I could not make the right turn because of the speed of the oncoming ZR van. When the ZR flew past me and eventually braked, the driver realized that there was a vehicle stopped on the right side, so he could not get out. He could not get past me because my vehicle is long and I'm waiting to turn, my indicator's on, He is partially blocking the road into which I'm going to turn. And he now wants me to either drive way past his vehicle and then reverse, or go up the street and turn around in order to make my right turn, or to reverse past the length of his vehicle, past the length of the car parked on the opposite side of the road, and create then a third vehicle space, which is the amount of reversing I would have to do for him now to get clear passage from behind the vehicle with which he is stopped. Ma, you gonna move. So at which point I just pressed my handbrake and smiled at him. I waited, because I was waiting to make my legitimate turn. He had been speeding. He's in a road that he has absolutely no right in, and he starts to speak to me in very colorful language. Well, I found it highly entertaining. I thought about returning some of his, muscular language, and then I remembered that I promised that I am going to become a lay preacher in the Methodist Church, and so I could not speak to him as I thought he deserved to be spoken. So instead, I smiled and started to pray for him. God bless you, love, and so on. Eventually he realized that I just had absolutely no intention of moving. So some of his passengers then started to look at me. There was then a chorus of muscular language coming from the vehicle, and I was praying God's blessings on everyone. Bless you, sweetheart. Good night, all the best for the holidays. Here you love, and so on. Eventually, he reversed because he had no option. And then when he started to reverse, I looked at the vehicle to say, well, whose ZR is this? Because some of the owners, I have to admit, live in my former constituency, and I'm looking now to see whose ZR this is. He has no license plate on the front of his vehicle, none. And he is driving a public service vehicle with people's lives. And if you look at all of the breaches of the law that he commits within that moment, driving recklessly, driving in an area where he has no legal authorization to be driving, driving above the authorized speed limit, and I could go on. But cursing me is not illegal yet, but maybe one of these days. But it made me start thinking about this whole matter there of the culture of the ZR and the ZR worker, whether it is the conductor or the driver. Years ago, there used to be a wonderful ad on television featuring John Walcott, the multi-talented artist, about a security guard who was famously named Tubby the Guard. Now, Tubby had a particular attitude which everybody who had encountered guards in Barbados knew was typical of that cohort of employees. But it seems to me that if you are going to be employed as a ZR driver in Barbados, that you have to have a particular attitude. And whenever you speak to ZR drivers or their conductors about things that they are doing that are wrong, they don't say sorry, they don't back down, they just abuse you in the worst way. They continue with reckless driving irrespective of how many times they're prosecuted or how many accidents they have. And there is a culture that has settled in, which I don't think speaks well of Barbados and is a risk to road users. And my concern is, and I'm saying that my concern, this is not government policy, I wonder if people who are driving vehicles which require, not to mention that there are some who drink, you can see them actually drinking beers and alcohol as they go by. You see some with spliffs, smoking as they drive by. I mean, all of this people pick up as normal citizens. And it seems to me that persons who are in whose hands are going to be entrusted the lives of Barbadians and the lives of Barbadian children and young people should be made to undergo some kind of psychometric testing to determine the nature of their personalities and whether they are really fit for driving public service vehicles of this type. Because this is more than just one or two people on the road. It seems to be a prevailing culture within the PSV sector, and it is deeply, deeply troubling. And I see it every day. I often take videos or photos of drivers doing absolutely crazy and reckless things, and it is only because other drivers avoid them. Other drivers see them coming and the fear of the Lord enters their hearts and they pull out of the way. But the drivers of these vehicles just keep going because they expect that because of their size and speed, people will avoid them. I think that there has to be greater discipline on the roads. And I say that being somebody who likes to drive fast myself. I love to see people driving fast. I love people who can drive well, etc. I don't drive excessively fast anymore. I admit that. But I am not driving a ZR vehicle. No. I'm not driving. Please do. I need all the prayers I can get. No, there was a point in my life when I really, truly enjoyed driving very fast all the time, and I admit it. But the point is that I was not driving public sector vehicles. I was driving myself. So that if I created a risk, the primary person for whom I created risk was for myself and anybody else who determined that they would willingly be my passenger, and maybe one or two other persons. But that apart, sir, I really do think that in terms of the risk to the general public, recently, and I don't want to suggest at all that it was the fault of the public service vehicle drivers, but recently there was a collision with two vehicles, and there was a very awful photographs of a man who was severely injured in the accident going around the internet. A heart-wrenching photograph of an injury. It really was very upsetting. But we do need to bring, and it isn't just, I think the police tend to stop them a lot for overloading. I tend to be a little more sympathetic to overloading, even though I know it is against the law, because people are trying to get home. And before, when we didn't have so many buses on the road, so many new transport board vehicles and so on, it really was extreme pressure with the amount of time people had to stand at bus stops. That brings me to the other point, which is that we know that there are certain routes that are plagued by illegal drivers and illegal vehicles, people that service particular communities who really are not authorized to be driving public service vehicles for pickup on routes in the way that we do. So this is a matter that, in my view, needs investigation and attention. I would have to say that since my encounter with that public service vehicle, with that ZR, and I'm deliberately not calling the number because I got out, even though the front license plate was off, and made sure, and the driver accelerated crazily when he recognized that I was trying to get the number of the vehicle, but I was able to get the number on the rear plate. But I have to admit that since then, I encountered another ZR coming through the same road in Wanstead Gardens. So it seems that they are now routinely doing this, perhaps to circumvent traffic when it gets busy at rush hour or whatever the reason may be, because the majority of the people using the ZRs would not necessarily be resident in that community. But this is a level of indiscipline and risk for Barbadians, and it is something that does need attention and control. I know that the insurance companies, and I've been privileged to see the forms that some of the Barbadian insurance companies use to assess drivers and their suitability. But that form really relates to the number of years the person has been driving, their driving experience, the number of charges they have had, and the number of motor vehicle accidents they have had. It does not at all speak to their suitability to drive a vehicle in which people's lives are dependent. And I'm deeply, deeply concerned about some of the things that I am seeing on the road. And I hope that at some point, this issue will be taken up as a matter of policy. I know that the operators will start to say that this is another expense that they are going to have to undertake, but you know, it is believed that they do make money, but that is not the point. The larger point is that people's lives need to be protected, and the extreme recklessness which now pervades the culture of the PSVs, in particular ZR vans, has to come to an end. With that, Mr. President, I come to my end, and I'm much obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Thompson. Senator Maynard.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would first like to welcome a new Minister of Health, Senator Walker, to the chamber. I've been waiting for 6 weeks to see it. And Mr. President, I would like to clarify the matter of George Street, because I believe that Senator Thompson did not hear me correctly. I was not in any way commenting on any political property. I was simply saying that my office is on George Street.
9th Avenue, to be precise.
Yes, thank you, sir. Mr. President, there was mention of digitization and the need for digitization. And while I agree entirely that it speeds up processes and it's excellent for keeping records and moving things into current state of technology, it does come at a price. And I would like to remind everyone that while we can advocate digitization, we must also advocate for adequate cybersecurity. And I will not say anything else on that matter. Mr. President, I have to agree with Senator Malalu on some points, and most of the other speakers so far. I don't know if this is the right time to amend the Road Traffic Act in its entirety, but there are aspects of it that need to be sorted. You see, since we have had an increase in economic activity, the trailers bearing the bobcats and the excavators and the rollers are back on the road. And the time has come in this country, Mr. President, where there has to be regulation regarding whether a trailer carries its own brakes or not. I would wish to tell this Parliament that if you look in Barbados, most of the trailers you see with bobcats on them have no brakes. They're unbraked. In the United Kingdom, if your trailer reaches over 750 kilograms, it has to have its own internal automatic brakes. So a truck could come down the road, and unfortunately the bobcat can get loose, and the trailer, and it will not stop. It will continue on its merry way and create carnage. And the time has come for, apart from having brakes on trailers, we need to have them with active lights, not just reflectors for the nighttime, but in the daytime. So when the driver of the truck presses his brakes, you can see that that long trailer ahead of you, the vehicle is braking, as we see everywhere else when we drive in other countries. Mr. President, now, the linking of the new driver's license to the ID card is a good idea and it's convenient, but I wondered whether we might see other uses of it, because we know that penalties in other places, one gets penalties for offenses, and they're attached to your driver's licenses. And I wondered if we are being told all of the intent with regard to the use of these new electronic systems, Mr. President. Now, the age for which you require a medical test for a driver's license needs to be changed upward. I think we have a healthier population and people are living longer, and the level of care which we receive allows people to drive for much longer periods. And it's rather inconvenient, I think, for everyone that a driver's license for an elderly person is so short. And I think the government needs to look at lengthening that time period, Mr. President, so that when you reach age 70, you don't have to come up every year to get a letter to say that you are fit to drive. Now, trade plates, Mr. President, I occasionally have had to use trade plates when I have had reason to test vehicles. And what Senator Malu said about the requirements that one has to meet to use the plates, they really are somewhat ridiculous. It means that if you have to write the exact route you're going to take into this book, I presume that if you are not on that route, then you could potentially have a problem if you're stopped. Now, there are times when you might be testing a vehicle and you realize that you need to test it in a hill, not just a mildly inclined hill like Map Hill, but you might need to take it into a long hill like Horse Hill and really run it in Horse Hill to see how it behaves. So there needs to be some thought given to the whole thing about trade licenses, and particularly, Mr. President, the time on the trade licenses. I have read it and I've been stopped on occasion when I've been testing vehicles, and I have noticed that it says from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. But there are times when you might want to test a car when it is cool, and you can't put trade plates on it and take it out when it's cool and test it because you're restricted. So there needs to be some modification of that also, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, the matter of weight certificates, we think of it in terms of cars, Mr. President, but trucks and buses and every vehicle that goes on the road also has to have a weight. They have an unloaded weight and they have a maximum weight. And it would not be reasonable to say, do away with it and have someone who has a truck that should carry a maximum weight of 12 tons transporting 60 tons. You can only imagine what would happen when you are coming down an incline and you press the brakes, what would happen. So I don't think we can do away with weighing vehicles, but the processes, Mr. President, need to be streamlined. And I do agree with Senator Malu that for new vehicles that leave a factory and come here, you probably should not have to go and wait in a line for 6 hours to get it weighed. A used vehicle, which may have been modified, may have had weight taken off of it, weight added to it, probably yes, Mr. President. But I think the processes that we have for both licensing, for getting new licenses, and for weighing vehicles are way, way too time-consuming. And they burn tremendous amount of fuel, Mr. President. If you consider you have to drive from Warrens back to the Pine and back to Warrens and back to the Pine, by the time you're finished, Mr. President, your day is done. You wasted an entire day with all the talk about going digital. And you can apply for a police certificate of character online, but you cannot apply for a driver's license or do a test online. and we need to change it, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Maynard. Senator Roberts Hodel.
Thank you for that, Mr. President. I want to say that it must be a chorus in the chamber today, as I find myself agreeing with a lot of what has already been said. And hence, I will try my best not to go over what is already well-trod ground. I will say for my one, I completely agree with the amendment as we have had it placed before us. I will say this, what I find it to be evidence of is something that this government, I implore it not to find itself caught up in. And that is the process of making amendments without a view towards who the law will actually affect. Because if I am accurate, as I've gone through preparing for today, I've heard persons who would have been involved at that point in time, at the point in time where the original amendment would have been made, who pointed out that this was going to be a problem, who said this was going to be a problem, and they were not heeded. I personally believe in a consultative process. I believe that we need to speak with persons before we do take some actions. And that is regardless of what government is in power. That is a part of good governance, in my opinion. Now, I say consultative process. That does not mean you bend to everything someone has suggested. That means you have a conversation and you see where you can meet in the middle. But I find in order to right an ill, which still exists, as attested to by the Deputy President, there were steps taken that severely hindered youth and our ability to engage in this particular kind of employment activity. Because make no mistake, I personally feel that something needs to be done about the PSV situation. And I say that as a child of this country who has had to learn and have the ability to contort my shape into small spaces on the appearance of, sweet girl, move around a little bit. Met little room there. So I fully understand. But I also believe it's an issue that we need to discuss. There are nuances in place because, yes, I have seen them break the law for very, very foolish things. I've seen them have a complete conference in the middle of the road, both sides blocked, no care or concern to the many horns that they hear. I've seen it. I myself pressing heavily on my horn. Sorry, I have somewhere to go, please move. I've seen them now take up residence and create new van stands on the pasture by the QEH, to which I pass and drive and wonder to myself, you have a whole new building. What are you doing out here? Blocking the road as they hustle for customers. I've seen it, and I myself have found it completely distressing. So I believe that we need to talk about them, and we need to have a discussion with them, because I have also seen the other half of that. I've seen PS vehicles take a little side road to drop Gran off at her house so she don't have to walk with the groceries all the way down the gap. I've seen that. I've seen the two sides of the coin. So I feel that we need to have a more consultative process with them, but not just with the operators, but with the owners of the vehicle. Because the reality is, the owners of these vehicles make money, and some of them, by your leave, do not care as long as the correct number of dollars land in their hand at the end of the night. And those gentlemen are hustling for their money. They have families to feed. They have things that need to be done. So they will do what they feel they need to do in order to make that money. They are employees just like anybody else. But the employers have a duty of care to make sure that they are taking activities and performing things that are necessary. So as I said, I don't want to trod on well-heeled ground because I believe in this point, other than a few nuances, we are all in agreement. And I've heard in the other place that there are to be more rules put in place to control PSV operation, or at least to make a hearted attempt at controlling PSV operation. But again, I wish and I beg and I implore for there to be a consultative process, because at the end of it, we do want them to be able to comply, and we do want there to be more safety on the roads. So, as I said, I wanted to make this very short. So I will commend the government for taking what is necessary, the steps that are necessary to correct this wrong. I think it's unfortunate that it has waited so long, and I would hope that it's not just because of the youth factor, because I believe that the issue that we shall never fall into is that you have to listen to people. That does not mean you do what they want. That means you listen to them and you see where you can make some adjustments. And I think the previous administration erred significantly when they saw that this was an error, but did not have what some would consider the testicular fortitude to admit it and to make the correct adjustment so that the youth of this country had opportunities to continue to engage. So again, I am in complete agreement with this adjustment, but I'm also in agreement with the fact that there are more adjustments that need to be made, that there's a change management process that needs to happen throughout the country. I understand that things happen in the best time that we have, and as politically as in governance-wise, timing is important, and we have to take not just the public, but those who work in these institutions, departments, and ministries along with us. We cannot make a dramatic change to which they will not follow down the same line and make the appropriate adjustments. So with that, sir, I thank you very much. I'm obliged.
Thank you, Senator Roberts Odell. Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon to all. How to begin? Initially, I had thought about not speaking on this topic. I made some notes, but I was a little bit uncomfortable with my inability to do the level of research and deep dive inquiry that I wanted to into the Road Traffic Act itself and into other matters, including those related to insurance, as some members have mentioned, that I think are important to consider when looking at both this act as the act which seeks to correct, I will use that term in inverted commas, as well as the amendment. I think it's a bit unfortunate to have received official notice of this meeting just 2 days before it was called, considering how extensive this legislation is. And yes, I note that we received the legislation prior. We were told that perhaps we would meet today, but perhaps is not the same as we will. But that aside, I think on reflection, it is important to note some of the things that I have written, in particular because I would not want for this honorable chamber to become an echo chamber. So, Mr. President, there are a few things that I have noted and that I thought about in looking at this legislation. First of all, I heard from Senator Cummins that this act will validate that which was done before. Further, it addresses an administrative lacuna, and it offers this corrective, as Senator Roberts Odell just noted. It corrects a wrong, which she said the previous government failed to notice, which in itself is extremely inaccurate. Extremely inaccurate because this legislation This legislation, the 2017 amendment, came in November of 2017, and the government change in May of 2018. So this was not an error noted by a previous This was, in fact, an action by the previous administration that it would not have corrected because it only existed for 6 months, before which they were no longer in power. And although this may seem like a minor point, it is not a minor point. It is a point of fact. It is not an error that they noticed and wanted to correct. It was something that they put in place for a reason. I don't know the reason. I'm not showing any hand. What I'm showing is the truth. And, well, we can deal with fiction because fiction suits. In any case, the reason I bring this up is because I looked at the 2017 amendment. And the 2017 amendment includes a lot of things. It looks at the treatment of all-terrain vehicles. It looks at random alcohol and drug testing for articulated and public sector vehicles. It includes speed limits in construction zones. It looks at breathalyzer testing. It includes a number of things that I believe, I was not here at the time, but I believe these things were to address some safety matters and also to deal with some changes relating to road traffic. So to say that this was an error, I do not believe is correct. I think this was an action that was taken for a reason. Now, I cannot say that I agree with the reason. And I say this because I know what it is like to be a young person that needs experience for something. I am someone that I received my qualifications at a very young age, in my 20s. And what do you hear? We need someone with experience. Well, how on earth are you going to get experience unless somebody hires you? So to move this age from 18 to 25, which is what the previous 2017 amendment did, actually foreclosed the ability for young persons to receive that experience. So waiting to 25 means that after you are 25 is when you can get that experience. So you are then older by the time you are able to have the experience to allow you to make use of this skill. So I can see that as problematic. But to say that this was an error that was not corrected previously is not true, because it was not an error. It was done for purpose. There was a reason for it. I don't know what the reason was, but there was a reason for it. So I tried, in the limited time that I had, the 2 days, to do a little bit of investigation to find out what the reason for this might be. Is it an insurance reason? Is it a safety reason? Is there any evidence to indicate that persons who are under the age of 25 are more likely to do harm when operating a heavy-duty vehicle? And to my surprise, and I have noted here based on the limited time frame, but to my surprise, some of those who I contacted who operate within the insurance industry said they had limited information on this, hard information. However, it has been the general practice to treat those with more experience as less likely to be engaged in an accident, and therefore they would attract lower premiums. So the younger drivers would generally attract higher premiums, and that it may not always be the practice that companies that hire persons to drive these types of vehicles would want to employ persons as young as 18 years old. But there's no hard evidence, they say, to show this. So my search for a reason was not fully forthcoming, apart from hearing that anecdotally, as in it is believed that persons who are under 25 tend not to be as careful on the road because of their lack of experience. So this may be why this legislation was amended in this way. That element of the legislation was amended in 2017. Not that it was an error, but there was a reason behind it. Okay, let me come to the point. So to say that this addresses an administrative lacuna, again, I do not believe this is accurate. It is not. It does not address an administrative lacuna. What we had was the law being broken. The law was changed in 2017. The law was changed, and for whatever reason, the law was not followed. It wasn't followed in 2018, 2019, 20, 21, 22. 5 years. That is not an administrative lacuna. That is not following the law. That is not following the law. If there is a point that someone wishes to raise on, I would encourage them to do so. This is all that I am saying. The law was not followed for 5 years. And it is worthwhile and it is useful to have corrections to errors. But to paint them as an administrative error, this was an administrative error that we are now correcting, is not factual. This is, perhaps there was some kind of communication error. This is a governance issue because you have legislation and you have entities whose job it is to follow the legislation. And if these particular entities are not following the legislation, that cannot be an administrative lacuna. That is a bigger governance issue. That you have legislation in place 5 years, and the authority responsible for the legislation either is unaware of it, and therefore goes about issuing permits and licenses in breach of the law. And this then is what has caused us to come here to introduce an act to validate the monies collected, the permits granted, and the licenses granted over that 5-year period. That's not an administrative lacuna. That is not a correction of an error that somehow was put in place to the disadvantage of young people. Although I do see that it is disadvantageous to young people because you want them to have that experience. But this is not just like a clerical error. It is not. And the reason I wanted to raise on this issue is because I think it is very important that what we do here, that what we do in the legislature filters through to the entities that are responsible for implementing the law. We cannot have situations where laws are passed and those who are responsible for bringing them to life fail to follow the law. How is this possible? How is it possible for 5 years? Why is it that only in 2022? That is very good that it happens all over the world. I deal with Barbados. How is it that in 2022, all of a sudden we realize, wait, people are getting these permits and licenses and they're not supposed to. The reason that we recognize this in 2022 is because somehow, for some reason, the licensing authority decided to follow the law. Yes, that is what happened. And in doing so, there were people that then complained, I have a permit, and now they're telling me that I cannot come in and get my license. And I need this now for work, but I'm being told that this cannot happen. And then there are people that said, but Skipper, I got mine 2 years ago. How you mean you can't get yours? The law no change? No, the law changed since 2017. How is this possible? And I understand we cannot go back in the past. None of us can. Some of us would like to go back in the past. I want to go back to fix some little things and come back forward. But we can't. We can't. We can only deal with the no. So in the present, it is useful that we are making this adjustment. But I beg, Mr. President, that efforts are made to ensure that things like this do not continue to happen, that we do not pass legislation and allow for the legislation, I don't want to say to be ignored, because I don't necessarily think that it is being ignored, but not to be known and implemented by the entities responsible for it. So that we could then, in 2022, what we could do is say, you know what? This amendment made in 2017 was rubbish, and it is disadvantageous to young people. So we will make a change so that we have legislation that is not disadvantageous to young people. That is how we should be proceeding. That is how we should be proceeding if we see something that a previous administration did that was wrong and we want to correct it. That is how we should be proceeding. but there is a significant problem with entities not following the law. And that is what I wanted to emphasize today, Mr. President. I thank you for allowing me the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hines. Senator Dr. Larenate.
Thank you, Mr. President, for acknowledging me. Let me first indicate that Senator Dr. Christina Hines is correct. The 2017 legislation that was done and the amendments was done under the previous administration of the Democratic Labour Party and the then Minister Michael Lashley. At that time, the 2017 amendments, that administration brought over 25 amendments. There were 25 clauses in that slate of amendments to the Road Traffic Act at that time, including Section 69, which has created the problem that we are here trying to correct. I also want to say, Mr. President, that it is interesting to note that in the debate in Parliament, when those suite of amendments was brought, that the opposition leader at that time, now the Prime Minister of Barbados, had berated the government that they had not done, the government at that time, that they had not done the necessary consultation in order to ensure that the amendment would have the necessary legs. In the context of the legislative process and what I am aware of, Mr. President, is that it is departments themselves who make recommendations for changes so that there is to be consultation at the department level. The minister can choose to agree or not agree. That debate then is brought to cabinet, and then cabinet can agree or not to agree. So that really and truly, the change really should have been discussed at the departmental level and then brought up. It is clear that in the context, particularly of this legislation, that there was a missing link in that consultative process, so that the department itself, that it was responsible for administrating that amendment, was seemingly not even aware that the amendment had passed. So subsequent to amendments, even in the context of agreements from cabinet, there is a cabinet decision paper that should go, that should be able to say, you know, this was the amendment that was approved, and so on. So that there was a missing link. And as I indicated, when we go back and do the research, that the then opposition had indicated that it was a rushed piece, set, or suite rather, because it was over 25 amendments, that was made by the then party, and the advice that had been made was that really and truly, as I think Senator Shanika Roberts-Odell was identifying, that really you needed to have a better process of consultation, and that in most cases it is the responsibility of the minister, Mr. President. Certainly if I'm responsible for a ministry and I have put legislation to the floor, if that legislation is passed, I would think that it is my responsibility to then to be able to discharge to the agencies that I am responsible for when the legislation has been passed to also be able to indicate. So even in the context of saying that there were 6 months in between the legislation and when the new administration came in, Mr. President, there was clearly a lapse. The point is, however, is that the government, in the context of recognizing that error and the disenfranchisement that it will have and the impact that it will have, is seeking to correct it in the context of the amendments before us. Mr. President, it is, as we have always said, imperfect. We've stood on this floor, Mr. President, and have been criticized for bringing legislative changes soon after certain acts have been passed. We're tinkering and all of those things. And we've always argued that we can either be content with something that is imperfect, just to say that we've passed it and therefore we need to live with it, or we can go back as being responsible members within the context of this chamber and the other place, of being upfront to be able to say we need to be able to make the necessary amendments at the point in time. So again, irrespective of the fact it is imperfect and we've been here for a period of time, today the government is saying we need to be able to make the necessary correction In this case, Mr. President, the amendment was not necessarily of this administration, or rather the injury was not of this administration, but we are seeking to ensure that young people are no longer disenfranchised, and therefore the validation allows for all of those persons that were previously disenfranchised when the chief licensing officer made the decision that she will stop issuing the licenses, that those persons that would have been issued licenses, 25 years by the licensing authority on the 11th of December 2017 to the 30th of September 2022, can now be able to have their licenses and have them acknowledged, and then as well also in respect of ensuring that the government now notes that for the age of 18 years to be the minimum age at which a driver's license to be issued to drive the contract carriage, the heavy goods vehicle, the hired car, motor car, or self-driven car. Mr. President, the final point I would want to make is in respect to the debate and discussion that we've been having on the need to improve processes to make sure that they are more efficient. And Mr. President, this is something that is very important to this government. And certainly, again, as a new minister coming in, it has been one of the areas that I have been working assiduously on. I've spoken, Mr. President, several times to government's commitment for results framework. But that is not the only transformational element that the government is seeking to do in order to make sure that it improves government processes over time. I want to recall, Mr. President, that we introduced in 2021 a digital payment bill as well. The government has also opened up the Easy Play platform in order to improve efficiencies of payments online in several areas on an ongoing basis as well. The intent is to roll out that platform, to expand it for other payments as well. So right now you can pay for the renewal of your driver's license online. The government, Mr. President, also has an ambitious program to digitize the whole of government. It is a public sector investment program that is being implemented under an IDB loan and managed by the Ministry of Industry, Innovation, Science and Technology. And that program, Mr. President, has two components to it. One, government digital transformation and service quality improvement, which focuses on increasing the adoption of digital channels to access public services by individuals and businesses. And also as well, component two, there are 5 components, and component 2, enhancing human resources management in the public sector, which focuses on enhancing the efficiency in the public service and strengthening the skills in the public sector for a digital economy. So, Mr. President, we are aware of the need to make sure that we improve service, improve efficiency. It is not a process that will be done within a day, within 2 months, and perhaps even over the lifetime of this administration within the 5 years. But we are investing in it because we understand that it's a transformational element for the public service which must be done. But at the same time, in the context of that transformation, we must as well note that we have to be able to do it in phases over a period of time, do education, get people accustomed to using the technology, as was indicated by Senator Maynard, I believe, address the issues of cybersecurity at all phases and all steps as we move forward to this process of transformation, Mr. President. Finally, Mr. President, I would want to just also indicate that even in the context of government's attempt to further ensure that we streamline our processes and enhance the efficiency and our engagement as well with the public as we do so, the government just recently, I think it was just a couple of days ago, at a social partnership meeting, invited the social partnership to make sure that they put on the table their views in terms of how we transform the Barbadian economy into a mission economy that is focused on growth. There was a lot of discussion about focus on growth, and the Prime Minister encouraged all of the members of the social partnership, and I was very happy to see representatives there for the civil society sector as well, to make sure that they come to the government with recommendations for various areas in the context of that mission economy. And it is something that we do together and that is owned by all sectors. So, Mr. President, my brief intervention was just one to indicate that the government is indeed moving to address some of those efficiencies. We will not be able to do it all in one shot, all at the same time, but we are attempting to, as much as we can, as resources are available, and we go after those resources strategically to address the issues, that we are doing so. But also to note that in this particular instance, we are seeking immediately to address a specific circumstance that has come to the government's attention, and that is disenfranchising a portion of its citizens. And we are asking, this chamber to be able to agree that we can ensure that those persons are no longer disenfranchised. I'm obliged, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Laura Knight. Speakers? Senator Nichols.
Mr. President, I am grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this debate. It has been wide and ranging, and I have found with very great interest the contributions of the senators who preceded me. I, for one, Mr. President, would like to respond to some of the things that I heard today in furthering, for the most part, most of what some senators have said, but from my own perspective. I do not accept that the age limit of a driver of a heavy-duty vehicle, public sector vehicle, has any correlation with the level of discipline in the discharge of the driving of that vehicle. The level of indiscipline on our roads by public service vehicles is something that is too deeply embedded in the society of Barbados, largely contributed by the persons who catch and use those vehicles too. Because when I went to Trinidad for law school, in fact, before then, when I started going to Trinidad as a university student, one of the things that struck me was that the people in Trinidad lined up for the bus. And before the City Gate terminal was opened up for all the public sector vehicles, private sector vehicles in Trinidad, what they call the maxi taxi stand in Trinidad. These maxi taxis used to come around certain street corners, and people would line up the corner in long, long lines of 300-400 people. I think the clerk of Parliament would tell you that people in Trinidad lined up for the bus. If you were standing on a road in Trinidad, 4 or 5 of us at a bus stop, and that maxi taxi was coming down and it had 2 seats, it will not stop. It will not stop to pick up 2. It will leave all 5 at the bus stop, because there is a discipline within that society as to how the whole concept of public transport operates. And I think that when we want to address issues of discipline, and I heard the minister speak in the other place, Mr. President, about changes are coming to deal with this thing, and I welcome that opportunity to participate in those wider discussions. But I want to really separate this notion that once we get the age right, we will curb the indiscipline on the roads. The indiscipline is coming from a different place. And I believe it is right for the government to revert to the original age of 18 years for a heavy-duty vehicle, using a heavy-duty machinery and vehicles that traverse.
Senator Dr. Hines, what do you raise?
Thank you, Mr. President. I just raise on a point of elucidation, because as I see from this amendment, the age is not being changed for the drivers of PSVs, but heavy-duty vehicles. Yes?
Thank you, Senator Haynes.
Chair, Mr. President, I don't think that that's the point I was making at all. I think that is more as a result of the itching urge to intervene in my contribution. I do mine as a sides, but I think my Honourable Senator could do the same. So I was making the point, Mr. President, that I don't believe any changes of age, whether it be 18 or 25, can deal with the issue of indiscipline. And I'm not saying that the legislation has changed the age in relation to public sector vehicle drivers. I understand that. I've read the bill. It still remains 25. But the point I'm making is whether it's 25, 18, or any age, it will not curb the indiscipline. So I just want the Honourable Senator, Mr. President, to be less anxious in trying to intervene in what I am, in my own contribution to the debate. Mr. President, I think most of us know, and I think this is the second time I'm making a similar submission. We know what the problems in Barbados are. I don't know the background of all the honourable senators, but I believe that I perhaps might be the only one in here who's ever worked on a public service vehicle because I had family that owned these vehicles. And if we go back to how this sector emerged and how we have dealt with it throughout the years, we can see that there may be a time when we look at the coming regulations to say, but these two are not sufficient. Because the indiscipline stems from a really deep systemic problem. When minibuses first started, they were not regulated at all. In fact, people had trailer trucks that used to carry lumber and that they would put a canvas on it and they would go down to town from the country, St. Thomas and St. Andrew and these places, carry the first loads of people to town and back to town 2 trips, and then they did the lorry and the ferry work throughout the course of the day, and then in the afternoon they pick back some people and then they go home and rest. And then in the 1970s, I believe the Barbados Party administration paved the way for minibuses to operate. And as that system came in, and then we saw in the early 1990s, Z taxis being issued that were operating on routes because there was no prohibition against a taxi operating like a bus or a minibus. And then the sector said, well, look, the government said we need to regulate that. So the operation then moved from Zs or ZMs to ZRs, route taxis. And this system just mushroomed and mushroomed and mushroomed. And throughout the years, the government has imposed more licensing fees on them. I believe, Mr. President, you and the Deputy President were in a cabinet and a government that brought a budget in which the Prime Minister then justified the increase on fees in the amount of resources that had to be deployed by the police to regulate the sector. Fines, demerit points, imprisonment, suspensions have not curbed this behavior over the last 30 years. There is an undercurrent that operates, that keeps this sector together, and it is resilient to the methods that we have deployed to regulate the sector. Let us be honest. I was much younger as an attorney in the Bridgetown Air Traffic Court when I was the only lawyer there, so the police sergeant, prosecuting sergeant was good enough to call my matter early so that I could go on to another court. And when the magistrate realized that it was a minibus operator that I was representing, he said, Mr. Nichols, no, this can't work. Them got to come last. I don't do minibus man early. Because that was the court's way of saying that I would keep you off the road in the peak hours to after 12 and 1 o'clock as a means of punishment, in addition to the fine that the court would impose. I wouldn't tell you, Mr. President, what I said to the magistrate, but I remember walking out and leaving the client in the dock because I didn't think that the way the magistrate addressed me was an appropriate way to be addressed because I didn't beg to come before her. But the point I was making, sir, is that all along, this sector has been a problem. But we have not looked at the source of the problem. I think that the point raised by Senator Manu, that this need to amend the legislation should have engendered a wider overhaul of the parent legislation is one way of doing it. But sometimes these debates and discussions add fuel and a valuable insight into the course of how we look at the broader legislation, so that I don't necessarily agree that you could only or you should really only amend legislation by doing holistic overhaul of a legislation and one fell swoop, because you will never get all of the things right even if you do that. And sometimes these debates on minor amendments, validations are important in the legislative exercise because they give the government of the day and the people who operate the sector. I'm speaking about the Transport Authority, the Ministry of Transport and Works and Maintenance, the senior government officials listening to the debate and taking notes as to what are the considerations raised, can have a broader perspective from which they can deal with wider systemic overhaul and review of the legislation. So that the debate so far, Mr. President, has been enlightening, and I do believe that the government is listening to the concerns raised here, particularly the contribution by Senator Marley, which I really enjoyed, and echo what he says. But I don't agree with him that we have lost the opportunity to deal with the legislation in a holistic way. Mr. President, in my view, one of the problems that we have is, I think the major problem is that we don't understand the role of public transport within the Barbados society and economy. To my view, and to my mind, public transport is a public utility. It's a service that has to be used by people. And we have not treated public transport as a utility service, because utility services should be publicly regulated. What we have is the government subsidizing the public transport sector in the Transport Board to a large extent, but the Transport Board does not even capture 25% of the market. So that massive subsidies go into operating the Transport Board every year, but it does not even cover 25% of the market. But it's important because those private sector vehicles, all it know, Mr. President, is in the off-peak periods are in the bus stands, hardly servicing the routes unless you're working on Highway 1 or Highway 7. But outside of that, you cannot get, a pensioner can't get a minibus going into the rural parts of Barbados with the same regularity as in the peak hours. So that the Transport Board is required to cut the slack, and the off-peak periods and evenings is even worse, because we're a prisoner administration, we were given 25 permits to one operator to run routes in Bayfield. At 7 o'clock, there's only one game in town if you want to get to Bayfield, and that falls disproportionately on the Transport Board. So that in a properly regulated system of public transport, which is required and which will also give us an opportunity to address the things that create the indiscipline on the roads, you will not have a private operator saying, well, I make enough money to get to my owner, so I can put on this vehicle at 7 o'clock and we go and get some diesel, and I tell you now, having people who work all around Barbados, particularly in the hotel sector, scrambling to get home into the hinterlands of Barbados and the rural areas of Barbados because it can't get from the coast into rural Barbados after 7 or 8 o'clock at night when shifts finish. So, Mr. President, I do believe that the Transport Authority has to start to take a more serious look at how this sector is regulated. I, for one, if I had to do it, Mr. President, I would believe that you don't have any issues about uniforms, minibuses and ZRs, all of them will paint the same color. They can be owned by private individuals, but they will be run in a system where they are rotated. You can create an algorithm to determine how the vehicles are distributed across the routes to service the public. And you have one, like in any organized society, there is not a free-for-all in public transport. And I think that is where we have missed the boat, that you've had a government system heavily subsidized, running alongside an unregulated sector that they can pull in vehicles, pull them out. Transport is a public utility that is used by the entire society. We should be encouraged to move from here to our offices on public transport if it were run efficiently. But it cannot be run efficiently if government is subsidizing a small part of the sector to a significant amount of resources every year, and the rest of the sector is unregulated. If you regulate that sector, then fellas don't have to be on the road trying to hustle, because they will be paid a salary. And the revenue from the entire sector goes back to pay the owners after the operational expenses are deducted. That is how proper industrial regulated transport systems function. I believe, Mr. President, unless we move to that system, that indiscipline will continue on the roads. So, Mr. President, with those few words, I will support this amendment, and I look forward to the opportunity for us to expound a little more on the transport system and the Road Traffic Act as a whole. And with those words, I am obliged, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Nichols. Senator King.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I really was not going to speak on this particular matter, but after listening to a lot of these submissions, I believe there's something that we need to talk about. And you know, it saddens me that oftentimes we are so afraid to call a spade, that we dance around a lot of the real issues where some of the things are concerned. So I've listened very carefully to people talk about the indiscipline in the PSV service and these types of things. You know, Mr. President, I had the privilege of traveling to Japan some years ago, and I was totally amazed and impressed at what I saw in that society. When you talk about discipline, simple thing I observed. Getting ready to go on to what you call a bullet train. School children, they're all lined up, waited until all adults got on to the vehicle, got on to the train, and then they entered and sat down quietly and got off at their stops. A simple process. This tells you this is not a behavior that is forced upon people or legislated. This is taught and adhered to. This is our problem, Mr. President. The Barbadian society has become lawless. Everybody's making all kinds of excuses for bad parenting, for a lack of ethics, for a lack of common sense. And this is very part ways with most people. Because what upsets me the most is that when you look and see who driving the PSV, who is taking the PSVs, you ask yourself, is there a sort of madness running through Barbados? And this is not now started. I can take you back to the 80s, I believe it was, when we had the incident in Black Rock. What was the name of what do you mean, what's the name? The Midnight Assassin. I will never forget it. There's a lot of nonsense, but nobody wants to call it out because everybody frightened that somebody can curse them tomorrow on the radio program or they can like them and all these kind of things. It's nonsense. And it has to stop. But you can't legislate everything. Because as a wise man once said, you cannot legislate culture. But it has to change. And who is going to change it? Senator Nichols made a point that I made in the other house some years ago. You have to deal with the people who actually own these vehicles. You want to put pressure on me as a politician, but now when it comes to the owner of the minibus, who, if you leave it as is, and it continues to be a source of disruption on the road, and all you are doing is finding the person who is driving it, and the person who owns the vehicle has no accountability at all. The problem will never change. And so I would like to see that when the new things come in, that a number of things begin to happen. One, if these incidents continue at whatever time you want, there was a thing in the States years ago, 3 strikes and you're out. If you want to take that approach, I have no problem with that at all. 3 strikes and you're out. Out for the driver, out for the owner. Because when you start to hit people where it matters in their pockets, that is when they begin to respond in the way that you want them to respond. And this is, unfortunately, the way of the world as we know it. And so it is important that as we start to build out the legislation and all the other things, that we also begin to look at the family structure. Behaviors are learned. And children who become adults, who behave in a certain manner, learn these things from a child to when they become men and women and continue with it. For me, it is unacceptable. And I say it loud and clear, unacceptable, that I should be living in a society where I'm afraid to even get on the same buses. It's madness. And the thing that bothers me the most is that every time we start to speak about bringing order to the society, somebody gets up on the radio station and says, poor black man. Who are you telling me that because I'm black, I should have no order? No sort of nothing. I just like a wild person. This makes absolutely no sense. And you have to begin, if it's the courts, if it's the police, if whatever it is, you have to bring these people to bear the consequences of their actions. We are going to make a mistake that we are going to continue, rather, to make the same mistake year in, year out, administration after administration. This is about dealing with a particular type of behavior in the appropriate way. I've said it for years, and I'm going to say it here again. There are too many social workers. There are too many of the things that you need who are not in the places where they need to be working. Mr. President, I worked at Government Industrial School for many years. You can see the transition from coming before the law courts to being unskilled in anything, to finding particular work. Therefore, you bring the same attitude and behavior to it, and it has to stop. We're going to wait until something worse than midnight assassin happens. Some years ago, people seem to forget. This is not just a Barbados thing, because I was surprised when I heard Senator Nichols talk about Trinidad, because I remained in Trinidad for many years too, and it ain't just as bad or worse. But people seem to forget that a few years ago, I don't remember how many, but in St. Lucia, a whole minibus went off the side of a cliff. Whole set of people's lives wiped out. Because of what? Because the person behind the wheel has no regard for the person's he or she is transporting. How can you put those kind of people to drive boat? People, if it happened in an airplane, you will hear the whole Barbados saying, oh, there, this man was drunk and this thing happened and blah, blah, and everybody would start thinking about, oh Lord, if tourists can't get here, if they got people flying planes that drunk and all these kind of things, but you're gonna allow it. But you can talk about it when it comes to the minibus because what? Got in the ear? No more. Gotta talk about it. You gotta face it. You can't keep skirting around what the real problem is. The real problem is that people have no regard for their own lives. Because if you did, you wouldn't behave in that manner. There's no reason for you to be on the road and closing your eyes sometimes. If you're on the left side, a minibus on the right side, just stop, and another one flame coming, pass it. And all you waiting to do is to see if you can go see Maker. So we can make as much amendments as we like. If you don't get that behavior sorted out, and if you don't take the measures that are necessary to deal with the owners of it, and the minibuses, as they say, you spend it up, man. And I don't know if any of us in this chamber or any right-thinking Barbadian anywhere in this country wants to live in a society that has no order at all. And it has to stop. So I really just want to make an appeal now as a Barbadian to the owners of the minibuses and to the young people that get the licenses and things sorted out, permits and whatever else that they gotta get sorted out, to stop and think about how you are contributing to this particular problem. And in some cases, I know it's because a lot of the people that own them don't getting them to go anywhere. You don't have to. But the people that have to have no other choice. So like any other business, good customer service is a priority. But it can't be good customer service if people sometimes feel as if there's cane in a cane truck. And when you do these things, it's somebody's grandmother, somebody's mother, somebody's uncle, somebody's brother that is in the van. That when you go and take it and skid it off the road and crash it and kill people, the ripple effect, nobody cares. But so that if I gotta be the one big bad wolf in the room and people curse me for the rest of the year, I'm good with that. Because it's important that somebody got enough stomach to call it for what it is. You know, the country is completely out of control. And if you don't nip these kind of things in the bud from early, this is what you get. So, Mr. President, like I said, I really had no intention to really speak on this because there are a lot of things that have been said that I totally agree with in terms of how do we get here? That something like this needs to be amended at this particular point in time. But I understand how these things go. But let us hope that this is not this does not become a regular occurrence with a lot of the other things that we got to deal with. So with those very few words, I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Speakers, Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to, in closing off the second reading of this amendment, this cognate debate, I want to express appreciation to all of the honourable senators who have spoken before. I wish to, of course, associate myself with many of the comments which have been made before, but I want to specifically take the opportunity to respond, first of all, to the comments made by Senator Malalou. Now, Mr. President, I don't think that there is anyone in Barbados who has not navigated the kinds of circumstances that Senator Malalou has experienced. I don't think there is anyone who has a child who attains the age of 16 who has not had to navigate the identical processes with learner's permits. I think that is a well-known and well-publicized fact among a large swath of Barbadians and not limited only to any individual person. I remember my own daughter, when she turned 16, she was a nuisance because the day after, she intended that she was going to get her permit. And so mommy had to go with her. And so it had to get done. So I understand that perfectly, as do so many other Barbadians. So the fact that there is to be a process which treats to that dates back actually to, it's funny, we've actually just been really switching up some ministries, obviously over the last little while, but in 2020, the then Minister of Transport, the Honourable Ian Gooding-Edgell, as he was then, publicly in a press conference on a Saturday, and I'm referring to the publicly issued newspaper statement, so it's readily available to anybody, and you can research it in a few minutes, as I did, just to see when it was spoken about, issued a statement that said a couple of things, and it spoke about the ability with a reform of the Barbados Licensing Authority to take both the application and the payment processes for permits online to enable persons who are applying for learner's permits as part of the amendments and the suite of amendments for the road traffic amendment. That was since 2020. It is publicly available information and was coming directly from the ministry. There was also a point made specifically about the persons who were over age 70 and what process there was. In that same press conference dating back to 2020, the then Minister of Transport and Works, the Honourable Ian Gooding-Edgell, spoke about the fact that Cabinet, since 2020, publicly available information. The Cabinet in 2020 approved the changes to the ages for medical certificates for persons having attained 70 to 75 years for a renewal period of 75. They'll be moved to 2 years, with the medical certificate being required every 2 years, while at age 85, the renewal period would be for 1 year. This was announced at the time as a cabinet approval, which had been given in 2020. And so it is contemplated that many of the amendments that are required would be incorporated in the substantive amendment, and it was announced at that time. Now, I also agree with the challenges of visitors' permits. I, in a previous incarnation with the responsibility for the Ministry of Tourism, encountered that myself, where we had a dedicated period of time within which you did not have the books for visitor permits, and we did have a discussion with the ministry at the time because it was a problem. And we too accepted that perhaps there needed to be a different mechanism, because I don't know of anywhere I have traveled myself in the world where I have gone to rent a car for the purpose of driving, and I have had to use anything other than my Barbados driver's license to prove that I am a certified driver in my country of origin. And so on that, I 100% agree as well. But the question of licenses for hired cars, Mr. President, brings me to my current remit in the Ministry of Energy and how that intersects with the Ministry of Tourism. Mr. President, there is a reality that Barbados has a net zero target. Barbados is aiming to phase out fossil fuel cars, and we have set a target publicly known for us to be able to progress along that timeline over an extended period of time. I have personally engaged with the representative body responsible for dealing with the direct tourism services, which would include hired cars, and this discussion has come up. A government that has stated publicly, locally, and globally that it is the intent to phase out then has to begin to have a conversation now, and I commit to having that conversation myself now, on greening the transportation sector, including public vehicles and energy and hired cars. The notion that we would bring in new hired cars and issue new licenses using fossil fuels, diesel or gasoline, when we have a target that is 2030 would be an irresponsible act. And so the discussion, as agreed with the representative body of the direct tourism services, which included that category of service provider, was this: let us have a conversation where you come back to us on how you will phase in the transitioning to either hybrid or electric vehicles that will coincide with the government's national energy policy, hybrid as a plank, as a bridge to get us to ultimately energy, and then let us work also on the apparatus that is going to be required, which will be charging stations, because that was the other element that was discussed. There are simply not enough charging stations presently to have implemented a policy that would have allowed for the greening of the sector at the time from a hired car perspective. And so the provision of charging stations at hotels, in restaurants, in all of the various places at a quantum that would have been required for the greening of the transportation sector, specifically the hired car sector, was something that required time. And so that is where we are proposing to go, but I can say to you that it is not the government's intention at this time to be in contravention of its own stated policy of greening the transportation sector, even as it includes the hired car sector. And so this is something that we are committed to working through and developing capacity for over time. So yes, we agree that the bureaucracy is problematic. Yes, we agree that there are some challenges there, but I also want to put the challenges in context, Mr. President. It is not fair either or accurate to say that the only reason that hired car companies are having difficulties with vehicles is because there's a bureaucratic process. Mr. President, during the COVID period, and I'm not asking this as secondhand information, I say this as firsthand, during the period of the COVID pandemic, where especially during 2020 and in the first part of 2021, where there were not as many travelers coming into the country as we did pre-2019, we had a scenario where many hired car vehicles, many hired car companies had to sell off their fleet in order to alleviate their cash flow difficulties and to ensure that they had working capital available to them. By the time they then needed to ramp back up capacity, many of the companies would say to you, as they said to us at the time, that global supply chain challenges resulted in them having difficulty being able to replenish their fleet at a rate at which they needed to, given the fact that they had depleted their fleet and they needed then to be able to get the cars. They could not get the cars from the source fast enough to be able to replenish a depleted fleet. And so there are never, one of the things I've learned in life, not in politics or not in government, is that A plus B is never going to equal C without a dummy variable in between there, and unless it is divided by time. There are always other factors that have to be taken into consideration that we may or may not always see. And the fact that there has to be that dummy variable that accounts for all of the unknowns, all of the things that I may not know or you may not know, that then accounts for where the result comes from, is something that we must always bear in mind. And the global supply chain issues relating to the acquisition of new cars, the energy transition to allow for those new cars to be green, those are all factors in the challenges that we then had with the hired car sector as it relates to the transitioning of permits and the provision of sufficient capacity. Mr. President, finally, I want to take a moment to speak about the issues that were raised by the colleagues on PSVs. I don't know if I heard any of the colleagues tiptoeing around the fact that there are some real issues. I think, in fact, Senator Rogers, I regret that you were not here at the time when Madam Deputy President was speaking about her ambitions to become a lay preacher in the Methodist Church. And she was speaking about the way in which the number of prayers that she really needed to be spoken over her life while being faced with an abusive PSV driver and their passengers. I regret that you were not here at the time, because it left me to say, I can pray for you, but you would have been a better choice, Senator Rogers, than me. But I think we were very clear, many of us, that there is a culture of indiscipline. But the culture of indiscipline doesn't go on its own, Mr. President. There's a culture of exceptionalism that goes along with it. Everybody else is wrong as long as they're not associated with me. But when they're my people, my preferred party, my preferred colleagues, my preferred sector, I can find an excuse as to why it's not their fault. But for anybody else, it is their fault. You are wrong, but my people, my sector, my party, my partners are not. So the exceptionalism that applies to owners, as was just said by Senator King, the exceptionalism that applies to others who are associated with the PSV sector is very much there. Not me, but you. Not us, but them. It is always fingers being pointed at everyone else except those with whom we are associated. And there is sufficient enough blame as it relates to the PSV environment to go around. Everybody associated with it has an accountability that has to be brought to book. And I am confident that from the minister, when he spoke, as at 2020, in that press conference that Saturday at the Barbados Licensing Authority, to the current Minister of Transport and Works when they spoke in the other place on this, and they spoke about the order that is coming to and needed for the PSV sector, that those are things that are not lost on this administration. All of us have had experiences, Mr. President. All of us would wish to see improvements in the sector, and all of us are committed to ensuring that the issues that were raised by the members around this honourable chamber today in need of further review are very much valid and important points that we as Barbadian citizens, responsible Barbadian citizens, are invested in. Finally, Mr. President, I would wish to express my appreciation to Senator Chantal Monroe-Knight for giving the detailed elucidation, as well as Senator Gregory Nichols for his legal analysis of some of the things that are contained in the draft of the amendments, and for all of the other honourable senators who spoke. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
The question is that this bill, order number 2, be read a second time. All of us senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the Senate do now dissolve itself into committee for further deliberation of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself to the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against?
Madam Chair, just
have a
for
quick
clarity,
question,
which are we dealing with at this point? Clause 1 of, there are two pieces before us? Are we dealing with them separately? I just wanted to be clear on which one we were dealing with, because I'm a little confused.
Well, well, Madam Chair, just for clarity, we are on order number 2. We did order 2 and 3 at the cabinet debate, but we will pass each one individually.
Let me put the question again. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 2 stand part.
The question is that clause 2 stand part. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no.
Clause 3.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 3 stand part.
Question is that clause 3 do now stand part. Will those honorable senators in favor kindly say aye? Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will those honorable senators in favor kindly say aye? Aye. Will those against kindly say no? The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Road Traffic Amendment Number 2 Act 2022.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Road Traffic Amendment Number 2 Act 2022. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Order number 3, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Road Traffic Learners Permit and Driving Licenses Validation Bill 2022.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now lead the chair. I beg to move this bill be read a second time. I'm sorry.
The question is that this bill, order number 3, be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate dissolves itself into a committee of the whole.
The question is that you do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Madam President, I beg to move that Clause 2 do now stand part.
Question is that Clause 2 do now stand part. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 3.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 3 stand part.
Question is that Clause 3 do now stand part. Will all honourable members in favour please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Report.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honourable members in favour please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Road Traffic Learners Permit and Driver's Licenses Validation Act of 2022.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Road Traffic Learners Permits and Driver's Licenses Validation Act 2022. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the Senate do now suspend for a period of 1 hour for a lunch break to reconvene at 2:55 p.m.
The question is that this Senate be suspended until 2:55 p.m. today. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This Senate is suspended until 2:55 p.m. today.